Oh, good morning, Aisa. Nice to see you. Okay, so we are going to be talking about Chapter 1 today, which is a bit about political culture in general, different types of government we see abroad, and common knowledge of Americans. If we have time, I would also like to do a brief discussion with you all. As we're going along, if you need me to repeat something or you have a question, go ahead and use either the hand raising icon. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't have it or you can't see it, you can also type your question into the chat box. Okay, so like I said, we're going to cover political culture today, talking a bit about just kind of general concepts and issues we're facing as a country. Okay, so there's a lot of confusion between the terms government and politics. More often than not, people tend to think they mean the same thing. They get used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Government is the institutions that are used to run a country. So government here refers to the executive branch, Congress, the Supreme Court. So again, government are the institutions. Politics is the conflict over who's going to run those institutions, who gets what, when, and how. So government is the institutions, politics is the fight over who runs that institution. Is it going to be Democrats, Republicans? Who's going to be in charge? So does that make sense? Okay. So one of the problems we face here is that we don't really trust our government anymore. In 2017, a poll found that only 18% of Americans trust the government most of the time. That level used to be 75% in the early 1960s. Part of that has been due to political scandals like Watergate, the Vietnam War, and so on. But by and large, Americans don't trust the government most of the time. 67% of us trust the government only some of the time. Now, there is slightly more trust amongst minorities compared to white Americans, but the reality is we don't really trust the government, and it shows. We also don't believe that we can have an effect on what the government does. We also think that they don't care what our opinions are, that they don't care what we want. How many of you, using the hand raising icon, how many of you believe that Congress or the president actually cares what the American people want? Yeah, it's understandable. It's hard to feel like the government is working for us when they make decisions that don't seem to make sense to us. Now, trust in the government will go up in times of crisis. For example, the percentage of people that trusted the government to do the right thing after 9/11 was very, very high. But that's not sustainable. And once the shock of 9/11 started to wear off, trust in the government also went down. Any questions, or do you need anything repeated before we move on? Okay. We also, unfortunately, don't have a lot of knowledge about the political system. In 2015, in a survey, most people could identify leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but not others. Only 31% of Americans could identify all three branches of the government, and only 27% know what it takes to override a presidential veto. To override a presidential veto, you need a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers of Congress. You've probably seen those videos where people like Stephen Colbert or Jimmy Fallon go out and they ask people about leaders or to name a Supreme Court justice, and people have no clue. Unfortunately, that's pretty common in the US. A lot of people don't have a lot of political knowledge. And that can really come back to hurt us when there's something very important that will have an impact on our lives. Several states sued to overturn the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And yet, when there was a survey done, only 27% of Americans knew that there was a Supreme Court case. And yet, if the Supreme Court had said the act was unconstitutional, millions of Americans would have lost their health insurance. So this lack of knowledge can really hurt us if we're not paying attention to what's going on in the government. There's also a lack of concern about the civil liberties restrictions post 9/11. There's been higher levels of support for government intrusion in the name of safety and terrorism prevention. People will grumble, but you don't see any real attempts to force TSA to stop making us take our shoes off or allow us to move food and liquids past the security point. We're willing to go through a body scanner to make us feel a little bit safer. So we're willing to trade a bit of civil liberties in the name of security, which is understandable, but it is a bit problematic. We also need to know more about how our local government works. Using the hand-raising icon, show of hands, how many of you would know whom to call if you didn't have water one morning in your house? Okay, good. Aisa, good. Okay, great. Glad a couple of you know. Yeah, you would need to call the water company. You would need to call City Hall. You would need to ask, was the water shut off because of construction? Sometimes they don't tell you. Maybe a water main burst and they don't notify the residents, so you don't know that you don't have water. Or if your electricity goes out, you need to know to contact your electricity company, or if there's a boil order. So our knowledge of federal government is pretty limited, but our knowledge of local government is in some ways even worse. All right, any questions before we move on, or do you need anything repeated? Okay. Great. All right, so time for a general knowledge test. Using the chat function, who's this man here on the left? Yep, that's one of our senators, Ted Cruz. Okay, who's this woman? Don't know. Okay, that is Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the candidates for president on the Democratic Party side this year. She's a senator from Massachusetts. Okay, any ideas who this gentleman is here in the robe? Okay, that's Justice Stephen Breyer of the U.S. Supreme Court. He's one of the more moderate voices on the court, a little bit more of a swing vote. So he's one of the Supreme Court justices. Any ideas who this man is all the way on the right? Never seen his face before. Okay, that's the mayor of McAllen, Jim Darling. It's understandable that most of you got Ted Cruz because, of course, he's our senator. And you did about as well as most of my classes do. Some classes, they know who Elizabeth Warren is. Most of the time, they get Ted Cruz and nobody else. So this is not uncommon. And it's not uncommon to know who our local leaders are. Most people couldn't pull their point mayor out in a lineup or their state representatives. So it's not uncommon to have limited political knowledge. If I showed you a photo of someone like Dr. King, you would probably get that right away. If I showed you a photo of Eddie Lucio, our state senator for this area, you probably wouldn't know who he is. So again, this is about average for most Americans. We can pick some political leaders out, but not others. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay, yeah, so you remembered her from the debates but couldn't remember the name. Sure. So you had that part of your brain that was like, I know her, but why can't I think of the name? Which is also pretty common. Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to discuss the various types of government that are seen around the world. An autocracy is a type of government where the country is essentially ruled by one person. So an example of this is the country of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country in West Africa, and for 40 years there was only one president, a man named Robert Mugabe. No one was really allowed to run against him for president, and opposition leaders had a tendency to quote unquote disappear before the election. So this is a type of government where one person is the president or leader and no one else really gets a chance to take over or run the country. About a year ago, there was a coup in Zimbabwe. They overthrew the president, and they're working towards democracy, but for 40 years it was an autocracy. An oligarchy is a country where it's ruled by a small group like the wealthy or the military. So China is an oligarchy. To be able to run for office, you have to be a member of the Communist Party, but you also have to get permission from the rulers of the party to run for office. You can't just run by yourself. You have to talk to someone fairly high up in the party and get permission to run for office. So it's a small group within the Communist Party that runs China. And of course, democracy is ruled by the citizens, free and fair elections, constitutions, accountability, and of course, the United States is considered a democracy. Keep in mind that only about 40% of the global population lives in a constitutional democracy. So democracy is not the most common type of government in the world. There are places that are shifting towards democracy, but again, it's not the most common type of government. There's also government considered authoritarian, where there's no formal limits on what the government can do. So an example of this is in Myanmar, or what used to be called Burma in Asia. The military there essentially runs the country, and for the past couple of years, they have been committing genocide against a small Muslim minority in the country called the Rohingya, and there's no mechanisms within the country to prevent them from doing this. Another example is the Philippines. The current president, Duarte, has basically said it's open season on drug users, drug dealers, or suspected drug users or dealers. So if a person is suspected of selling drugs, they can be executed on the street without the benefit of a trial. People are literally gunned down in the streets with no proof that they may be drug users. So essentially the government ignores the rules of law and does whatever it wants. And the last type of government is called totalitarian. This is where the government controls every area of the country, the economy, the military, education, healthcare, all of it is controlled by the government. No private education, no private media. So Syria is an example of this, as is North Korea. In North Korea, of course, there's only the state channels that broadcast propaganda. The government controls healthcare, where people live, education, all of that's controlled by the central government. Okay, any questions before we move on? Okay. All right, so in terms of the ability to participate in politics within a democracy, there are different types of participation. The first is what's called a representative democracy. Representative democracy is where we choose the policymakers, and the policymakers create and pass the laws and regulations. So essentially, we entrust certain individuals to make the laws. In a direct democracy, we would vote directly on the laws and the policies. Now, direct democracy doesn't exist on the federal level. We don't get to vote on the laws Congress passes. But we do get to vote in a direct democracy form at the state and the local level. On the national level, it's a representative democracy. So here in the US, direct democracy is mostly through local and state ballot initiatives. Passing laws like marijuana laws. Several states have legalized marijuana: Massachusetts, California, Colorado, Washington, and others. Medical marijuana is legal in states like Michigan and Florida, and those were voted on directly by the people. Another example is the infamous Proposition 8 in California that banned same-sex marriage in the state. Was eventually overturned by the state courts because of the wording of the ballot initiative. Here in Texas, our direct democracy is voting on the state constitutional amendments. So last year, there were 10 ballot proposed amendments to the Constitution that were voted on by the people. 9 of the 10 amendments were added to the state constitution. So this is how we get to directly participate, by voting on state laws. Things like raising a local minimum wage or creating a bond referendum to improve water drainage in Weslaco, things like that. And within democracies, there's also the belief that all interests should be represented, that everyone should have a chance to try and get the government to pass the laws that they want. Now, the problem with pluralism is if you have too many groups advocating for too many different things, then the system turns into chaos. And it can hurt the larger public interests if certain groups win all of the time. So pluralism is the idea that multiple ideas should be represented to the government, but of course in reality not every group can win. There's always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers. There's going to be people who benefit from the system and people who don't. All right, any questions or comments before we move on? Okay. All right, demographically speaking, in the United States, in terms of race, a little over 3% of the population identifies as more than one race. That number will very likely go up once we process the census information from this year. In 2005, they added the ability for all of us to be able to identify as more than one ethnicity on the census. So for example, you can identify as Hispanic and white, or Asian American and Hispanic, or Black and white. Because for a lot of people, they don't necessarily identify with one race. A lot of people might consider themselves biracial, multiracial. So people now have the ability to identify as more than one race on the census form. In terms of people born outside of the United States, it was about 13.5% of the population in 2013. Again, we'll get better numbers once they finish the census. data and processing at the end of this year. Over half of our foreign-born citizens come from Latin America and the Caribbean. About 4 out of every 10 foreign-born citizen comes from Mexico and Central America, which makes sense because, of course, it's easier to travel over land than it is to have to go halfway across the world or go across the ocean to reach the United States. We do, of course, also have issues with undocumented immigrants. It's estimated that there are about 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. It's estimated because, of course, there's no way to really get an accurate number. People aren't necessarily going to step forward and say, I'm here illegally. So it's an estimated number. And of course, there's a lot of issues about, do we give them health care? Should they have the right to get a driver's license? Do we need to create a path to legal immigration? What do we do about undocumented immigrants? So it's an ongoing issue that we're going to have to deal with for many years to come. We're also seeing a bit of a shift in terms of religion. 23% of the population no longer identifies with any organized religion. Some of that is people identifying as atheist or agnostic, and some of it is just the fact that people have moved away from going to church, identifying with a particular religion. We have also seen a decline in the percentage of people who identify as Judeo-Christian, so people who would be Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. It went from 95% in 1968 to 72%. So we are seeing people moving away from identifying with a particular religion, and less people identifying as Catholic, Christian, or Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. So we are seeing a change in terms of religious identity as well. Okay, any questions, comments? Okay. We are also becoming an older population. In 2016, about 15% of the population was over the age of 65. That number will go up. The generation that they call the baby boomers are the babies born between 1945 and 1960. This was the largest population boom in the United States in terms of births in the 20th century. So now these baby boomers are reaching their senior years. They're getting older. So the percentage of the population over 65 is going to increase. And we are going to have to deal with the fact that there's going to be more pressure put on Social Security, more demand for Social Security benefits, Medicare, and Medicaid. The median age in this country is a little under 38 years. Again, that number will likely go up. The birth rate has significantly declined. More and more young people are either choosing to delay having children or not having children at all. So we are seeing a lower birth rate, which means the median age will go up. And this is a global phenomenon across Europe and a lot of Asia. the birth rates have declined, and they're calling it a grain tsunami. The number of elderly people at some point may significantly outnumber the percentage of children being born. So our population is getting older, and we're not seeing high levels of births compared to previous generations. And that's another issue we're going to have to deal with. Geographically, 82% of Americans now live in urban areas. Obviously, the reality is a lot of people have moved out of agriculture, farming, ranching, and they're now working mostly in high-tech industries, in cities. So this is a little bit of a problem in terms of the Senate, because with every state getting 2 senators, it means that the rural areas are significantly overrepresented in the Senate, and urban areas are underrepresented. So that's going to be another issue. Oh, cool, good. I'm glad to hear that, Isaiah. Yeah. I mean, it's not it's we do see more agriculture in the Midwest still, states like Illinois, Texas, Nebraska, Iowa, etc. But in a lot of states, Florida, California, and others, they're moving more to the cities and less urban areas. Socioeconomically, this is also a bit of a concern, because the top 1% earn about 20% of all of the income generated in the United States every year. The top 10%, the top 10 wealthiest Americans, earn about 50% of the total income generated every year in the United States. The poverty rate is at about 15%. The middle class is declining, and we are seeing some concerns about the income inequality gap, the fact that it's increasing rather than decreasing. Yes, exactly, Jose. They don't pay their fair share in taxes, partly because of business taxes, and partly because if they're smart, they don't keep most of their money in the United States. Yeah. Yep. Population-wise, we're sitting at a little over 300 million Americans. We'll get a better idea of that exact number with this census, but the average member of Congress does represent a little over 700,000 constituents. The Founding Fathers originally wanted them to represent no more than 30,000 constituents. Obviously, that's not the case. If we wanted to do something about that, we'd probably have to double the size of the House of Representatives. And I don't see that going over very well with the American people. So the reality is the average member of Congress is representing a lot of people. And so there's a lot of pressure on Congress because they're representing over 500,000 people in their districts. Oh, and by the way, they blame millennials and Generation Z for the declining birth rate. So another thing they get to try and blame my generation and your generation for. So there you go. Okay, so in terms of some of the beliefs, some of the ideas that make up our political culture. Our political culture is essentially our values, beliefs, and attitudes. It's how we answer the question, what does it mean to be an American? There are some common answers we tend to see when the American people are asked that question. When we get asked, what does it mean to be an American? Well, one of the things that gets mentioned, of course, is liberty, right? That we have freedom, that we have personal and economic freedom, that we have the right to criticize our government, to own a gun, to be on birth control without the government interfering with that, the ability to publish a critical letter in a newspaper, and of course economic freedom, the ability to open a business, to run our own shop. Things like that get emphasized. And there are fewer restrictions on issues like freedom of speech, individual moral behavior, and the press, but there are some conflicts over what can be restricted, right? What do we do about issues like hate speech? But by and large, there aren't very many restrictions on freedom of speech and personal liberty. Where we do run into some issues is over the fight between liberty and security. So an example of this is the 2016 San Bernardino shooting. A married couple walked into an office party and shot and killed, I think it was something like 14 people. Both the husband and the wife were then killed in the crossfire. The FBI needed to get into their iPhones to see if this was part of a larger terrorist plan. So they asked Apple to unlock their phones, and Apple refused. Apple said, this is a violation of our customers' privacy. We will not unlock the phones for you. Because if we unlock the phones for you, then it's a slippery slope to who do we open the phones for, and we lose our customers' trust. So the FBI took them to court, and eventually they were able to unlock the phone on their own. And a lot of people sided with Apple on this and said, you shouldn't be forced to hand over your personal information to the government. That cell phone companies shouldn't be required to divulge our passwords or our technology information. But it's an ongoing issue. Where do we draw the line between the right to privacy and protecting the American people? It's an issue we're still having to deal with. There's also the belief, of course, in laissez-faire economics, that there shouldn't be a lot of government interference into the marketplace, and that businesses work best when they're left alone. There's also a very strong belief, of course, in equality, that we should be able to succeed as far as we can, that any of us could create the next Facebook or become the next Imagine Dragons or be the next Bill Gates, that everyone should be allowed to succeed as far as they can in life. Any questions or comments? Okay. We also believe in the idea of political equality, that all Americans should have the right to equal participation in the political process. And in some ways, that's true, right? Most Americans have the right to vote. Now, you do lose the right to vote while you're in jail and if you've been convicted of a felony. The idea is once you turn 18, you can register to vote and you can participate in the system. But it's not equal access. Obviously, if you are relatively wealthy and you can donate to a lot of political campaigns, you're going to have more access to politicians. You're going to have a bigger bite of the apple. So it's not equal in that sense. Because of the problem of money in politics, which we'll discuss later, is equal participation beyond voting. Where we get a little bit more muddled is in the ideas of economic equality. Should we guarantee a basic income? Should we try to create opportunities for less wealthy Americans? There is still somewhat of a belief that if you fail, it's your fault. You didn't work hard enough. You didn't try hard enough. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Go to college. Get an education. Also, there's issues, of course, over equality of education. The way we fund education is through property taxes. So obviously, a school in Beverly Hills is going to be much nicer than the school in Compton. Is that fair? Well, it's still an issue we're dealing with. Is that really fair? There's also debates about equality in private life. Most people would agree that what you do behind closed doors is nobody else's business. But where we see differences of opinion is over issues like abortion. Do women have the right to obtain an abortion, or does the government have the right to restrict it? What about same-sex marriage? Obviously, it's now legal all across the United States, but before it was, there are questions about, is it the government's place to regulate marriage? So it's still an issue that we have to deal with. Does the government have the right to intervene into someone's private life to make moral decisions? We also, unfortunately, have the dubious distinction of having the largest income gap in the developed world. Part of that is because of our tax system. In a lot of countries in Europe, the wealthiest pay somewhere close to 50 to 60% on income tax. Nowhere near that high here in the United States. So because of the tax system, unfortunately, we do have the largest income gap in the developed world. Now, 57% of Americans believe that the government should do more to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. And 74% of Americans believe corporations have too much power. Where we disagree is on what the government should do to rectify this situation. Should the government increase taxes on corporations? Should they put restrictions on what corporations are allowed to do or not? Should the government guarantee a basic income for all Americans? We agree there's a problem. We just don't agree on how to fix that problem. All right, questions? Comments? Okay. So in terms of how democracy works in the United States, You're right, Jose. Even if they were to increase taxes, they would find loopholes. Yeah. One suggestion that's been made by politicians like Bernie Sanders is to close some of the loopholes. The people will always find new loopholes, new ways around it. Yeah, that's very true. Okay, so in the United States, democracy rests on the concept of popular sovereignty, that politicians are accountable to their constituents, that political authority rests in our hands. If you don't like what President Trump has done in office, you can vote him out in November. If you're unhappy with Senator Cornyn, who's up for re-election, you can try to vote him out of office. If we don't like what our leaders are doing, we can tell them. We can say, you're not doing the right thing here. We need change. So the idea is that we do get to hold our politicians accountable, that they should be listening to us. It's also a system of majority rule, minority rights. Now, the government will follow the preferences of the majority, but they're also going to work to protect the rights of the minority. So, for example, let's say the death penalty, right? Even if the majority of the population supports the death penalty, they're still going to put restrictions in place. They're not going to say that anyone convicted of a felony can be executed. There's going to be protections in place to try and make sure someone who's sinned doesn't get executed. Protections for religious minorities. Things like that, trying to protect the rights of the minority while also listening to the majority. There's also a lot of concerns about the role of money in elections and politics. And we're going to talk more about that later in the semester, but the problem is that campaigns are expensive. In 2016, in the general election cycle, which was about August to November, between the two of them, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent a combined $1 billion in that 4-month cycle alone, 3 months. $1 billion. If you want to run for the Senate, you got to raise probably $20 to $30 million. So there's a lot of concern about the fact that people who might want to run for office can't afford to do so. In terms of voter turnout, 2008, about 61.5% of voters turned out. Yeah, that's part of the reason Beto lost money, but also voter turnout. 2008, we had the highest voter participation since 1980. And unfortunately, it's pretty low. 2016, we had a little over 55% of eligible voters taking part. Part of that was because people didn't like the candidates, but part of it is that people don't show up to vote. In a midterm election, we're lucky to see 30 to 35% of eligible voters showing up to vote for the House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, and some governor's races. So the power is somewhat in our hands, but the problem is people don't show up to vote. Okay, any questions? Yeah, unfortunately, Jose, yeah, it may be worse with COVID. I'm hoping what will happen is a lot of states will expand the criteria for mail-in voting so that people won't have to risk going to the polls. I'm definitely going to vote no matter what, but for some people, it may not be worth the risk. And it's unfortunate, but I can't say I blame someone for not wanting to take the risk to vote, which is why I'm hoping States will expand vote by mail so people will still vote without having to worry about potential exposure to COVID. Okay. There's a lot of disagreement, obviously, between the different factions in the United States, but there are some things that we do agree on. 55% of Americans think the federal government has too much power. They would like to see more power given to the states instead. We also find across the aisle that there's a supermajority of Democrats and Republicans who want funding for Social Security. 86% of Republicans and 95% Democrats support increasing spending on Social Security. So this is a very popular program. You won't see a lot of politicians talking about reducing Social Security spending. Sorry. You'll also see high levels of support for transportation. 91 to 92% of Democrats and Republicans think we need to spend money on transportation, improving the roads, building high-speed rail, expanding public transit. So there are some issues on which we do agree. There are some commonalities where both sides will come together and work on a common cause. But there's also a little bit of an inherent contradiction. Americans, broadly speaking, want a smaller government, but then they want the government to create new programs and expand spending. They want a better healthcare system. They want a better education system. But the only way to do that is to expand the size of the government. You can't reduce the size of the government without reducing the number of programs. The government has to be large to do all of the programs that people want. So you can't have a smaller government and more programs. It can't work. And we do find that Americans do want the government to support us in times of, okay, why can't it work, Leslie? Okay, so let's say we create universal health care in this country, where everyone enrolls in one program created by the federal government, one single-payer healthcare system. If we eliminated 90% of the healthcare agencies, there would not be enough personnel to support this program. By necessity, we would actually have to increase the number of people, the amount of money, and the programs that would be associated with a single-payer healthcare system. If you have 300 million people on one healthcare plan, but you only have, let's say, 2 million people working in the federal healthcare system, it's not going to work. So the reality is it would be very, very difficult to reduce the size of the government, but still provide all the programs and services that people need. You have to have the personnel to be able to handle the demand created by the American people. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. So again, people want government support after a natural disaster, right? Hurricane Laura is hitting part of the Gulf Coast as a Category 4 hurricane, which is one of the worst categories. Category 5 is the worst. When there's a major natural disaster, we need the government to come in and help us. Ezekiel, yes, exactly. It's like a small school district trying to have more programs, but not enough. Yeah, that's a very good metaphor. Yeah. So we want the government to intervene after a natural disaster. We may not trust them, but we expect them to show up, right? We expect FEMA to help out the valley after Hurricane Hannah. The people living in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast of Texas who are going to lose their homes, their businesses. Obviously, they're going to be looking to the state and the federal government to help them out once Hurricane Laura passes through. After Katrina, the catastrophic damage that was done, there's no way to really rebuild without government support. So we don't necessarily trust the government, but when there's a crisis, we do look to the government to solve our problems. We do rely on them to help us. Because obviously, rebuilding a city like New Orleans or cleaning up huge sections of the Gulf Coast won't really be possible without government support. Okay, any questions? Okay, so since we do have a little bit more time, I'd like to share a YouTube clip with you all from a show called The Newsroom. Some of you may have already seen this clip. Some of you may not have. It does contain profanity, but I think it raises an important point, and then we'll talk about it after I show the clip. Okay. Yes. Okay. Say in one sentence or less what can you say about Americans is the greatest country in the world? Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way. Yeah. I'm not letting you go back to the other part of that. Well, our Constitution is a masterpiece. James Madison was a genius. The Declaration of Independence is for me the single greatest piece of American. It don't make sense. What's a set of laws and the other is a declaration of war? I'm a shitty moment. What about the people? Why is not the greatest country in the world? Professor, that's my answer. You're saying yes. Fine. Sharon the is a loser. Yeah, it counts for things.
sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. For moral reasons. Acted like men. He aspired to intelligence.
Okay, so I apologize if you couldn't hear some of that, but broadly speaking, do you think America is headed in the right direction? Okay, would anyone like to share their opinions? You can use the hand raising icon or you can type it in the chat. Yes, Ezekiel.
Well, personally, well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, personally, I think it depends on the topic exactly, because if you're talking about like the government, then that could be one discussion. But if you're talking about like the whole, how do you say, population mentally, like now, like there's so much arguing and clashing with each other. That's a whole different topic, But again, it depends exactly what you're talking about when you're trying to get into if America's on the correct path.
I mean, just in terms of like where we are as a country, with the divisions and everything, is this something we're going to have to deal with going forward? Or is this something we could possibly fix?
Oh yeah, I think we're on the correct path, because it's like they say, you learn as you go. So like the more mistakes we're making now in the present moment, the better we could fix it and alter it to what we need in the future. So yeah, I think we're on the correct path.
Okay, thank you. Leslie, I think it's a provocative clip, but I like to show it partly because it is provocative. I like that it's a little bit salty. I think he does raise some good points in the video. I think that we have become very divided in a lot of ways. Liberal versus conservative, pro-Trump, anti-Trump. Who'd you vote for in the election? Why did you vote for this person? Why don't you support Black Lives Matter? Yeah, let me go ahead and okay, so this is the no, that didn't quite work. Okay. Okay. Copy and paste. And yeah, I'll put a link in Blackboard so you guys can discuss it if you want to. I do think there are some issues that we have dealt with as a country that we really need to be looking at. I'm sure most of you heard about the recent shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I've seen a lot of people going back and forth arguing about it on social media. Some people saying you're anti-cop, other people saying you're racist. We've lost the ability, I think, to really have a civilized discussion with each other, to agree to disagree, to be able to respect someone else's opinion. And I think we need to find a way back to that. And part of that is because of our political leadership. When we have a Congress that won't talk to each other, when Mitch McConnell said, I will do everything I can to derail President Obama's plans, you shouldn't be saying that, right? You should be willing to work with the president. Democrats should be willing to work with Republicans and vice versa. I think we need to find our way back to that bipartisan cooperation. Now, where I disagree with the video is I don't think that your generation is the worst. There have been generations that are truly terrible. This is not one of them. I actually have a lot of hope for younger millennials and Generation Z, because I think the outrage you're feeling, the anger, will actually be very useful in driving this country forward. Y'all have been screwed 6 ways from Sunday. This is my second major recession in my lifetime. The first was 2008. I went through that horrible recession, and now it's coming back around again. I can't afford to buy a house. I have massive student loan debt. I think our generations have been hit very, very, very hard. And I think there's a lot of very righteous anger and cynicism from these generations because of the fact that we have been so hurt by the policies and the leaders. So I actually think your generation's on the right track. I think that if you keep up that anger, that passion, that drive, you could do some amazing things for this country. So I think your generation is actually hopefully going to do some really good things going forward. So I don't think you're the worst generation. I have a lot of hope for young people. Yeah. I mean, it would be nice if we could agree to disagree. I mean, I have friends who are Republicans, friends who are independents, friends who are Democrats. And yeah, sometimes it gets a little heated. But we do try to take a step back. We do try to re-look at things. And I'm not perfect. I get angry sometimes, and I type something not very nice in a Facebook post. But I do try to keep it civilized. And I do try to hear someone else's opinion on something. And I wish we could go back to that, at least a little bit. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, I said, sometimes I'm just like, especially because as a political scientist, sometimes I'm like, I know you're wrong. I know you're wrong because I've studied this and I'm trying to be civil about it. And I don't want to pull the, I know more about this than you do, but it's tempting sometimes. It's tempting. Yeah. Okay, any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, that's true, Leslie. We all want our arguments to be heard. The problem is when it becomes a shouting match and nobody gets heard. Okay, any other comments? This has been a great discussion, guys. Thank you very much. Yes, Ezekiel, we will start in person next week. First 10 will be in class on Tuesday, second 10 on Thursday. Aisa, I don't think COVID is going to be over until we have a vaccine. And even then, I still think it's going to take us probably another 2 years to get back to what we considered normal. I don't think COVID will be over until we get a vaccine and a really good cure. It's going to take a long while to recover from this, in my opinion. I think that we're in for a bit of a long road ahead of us. COVID's going to be here for a while. Until we get an effective vaccine, I just don't see how things get back to normal. Exactly, Jose. It doesn't have a political agenda. Doesn't care if we're Democrat, Republican, whatever. Yeah. And David, yes, you're right. It won't be over anytime soon. I do recommend that you get a flu shot. It won't protect you against COVID, but it will help with the flu, and it can minimize some of that risk. So if you have the ability to get a flu shot, I strongly, strongly recommend that you do so. But I do understand if you can't. But if you can, try to get a flu shot for this season, especially if you can. Yeah, we just have to continue being safe, wearing masks out in public, hand sanitizer, limiting contact with others. Something tells me it's going to be a very, very quiet holiday season. I don't think there's going to be much celebrating on New Year's Eve. I think it's going to be a very, very quiet end to this year. All right, well, that's the end of class for today. Thank you guys so much for sharing your opinions and thoughts and the great questions. Next Tuesday, we will cover Chapter 2, the creation of the Constitution. Using the PDF, can we do? Yes, you can bring your laptop to school if you want. You can definitely bring a laptop, iPad, whatever. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, that's fine. So yeah, Tuesday we'll cover Chapter 2. If you have any questions between now and Tuesday, please feel free to email or call me. I'll post a link for the YouTube video in the discussion board so you guys can watch it and discuss it some more if you want. Have a good weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see